Sorrow and profound fatigue are at the heart of Dewey's silence. It had been his ambition to learn exactly what happened in that house that night. Twice now he'd been told, and the two versions were very much alike. The only serious discrepancy being that Hickok attributed all 4 deaths to Smith, while Smith contended that Hickok had killed the 2 women. But the confessions, though they answered questions of how and why, failed to satisfy his sense of meaningful design. The crime was a psychological accident, virtually an impersonal act. The victims might as well have been killed by lightning. Except for one thing. They had experienced prolonged terror. They had suffered. And Dewey could not forget their sufferings. He hoped to see Perry and his partner hanged. Hanged back to back. That is a passage from one of my personal favorite novels, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, a non-fiction novel centered around the real-life murders of the Clutter family on November 15th, 1959, in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas. The murders were perpetrated by Perry Smith and Richard Hickok, and included the deaths of the 2 parents, Herbert and Bonnie, as well as their teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon. The killings were brutal, seemingly senseless, and they rocked mid-20th century America. Because in the public perception, things like this just didn't happen in places like this. And while the nonfiction element of Capote's nonfiction novel has been rightly questioned in the decades since its release, it continues to captivate audiences to this day. And I think a major part of why is because of passages like that. Whether Capote realized it or not, In Cold Blood is not so much about the facts of the case as much as it's about exploring the feelings that the case generated. The fear, the paranoia, the desperation for answers, some kind of explanation. And Dewey's rumination on that explanation here, the strange dissatisfaction he has with it, is very interesting. He wanted it to be more. He wanted there to be some greater reason for why this horrible thing happened. And yet, it was only a psychological accident. In other words, it was pointless, unnecessary. It's a rather common occurrence to feel dissatisfied with the answers a story provides, whether that story is real or not. You get to the end of a mystery story and find that the answers you were looking for are, for one reason or another, just not that fulfilling. No big plans, no true motives, nothing that lives up to what you, consciously or otherwise, cooked up in your imagination. And a recent example of that experience for me was playing through Alan Wake. I'd never played this before. It had been on my list for a while, and I owned the remastered version on PS5 pretty much since it came out, but I just never got around to it until recently, figuring that with Alan Wake 2 close at hand, there was no better time. I went in knowing very little, other than that there were a lot of woods, something about a writer, and the use of a flashlight as a weapon. And when I started it, I was immediately hooked by the mystery at its center. Alan Wake has lost a week of time from his memory, his wife is missing, and he's discovering manuscript pages of a book he supposedly wrote despite his current bout of writer's block. A book that seems to be coming true before his very eyes. And while I enjoyed my experience with Alan Wake thoroughly, by the end, I was left dissatisfied. Because by the end of Alan Wake, what you're left with is a story that makes perfect sense, at least by the logic of the game's rules anyway, just like how Dewey had a perfectly plausible explanation for what happened in that house that night. But there was something missing, the earth-shattering revelation, the twist that would make me reinterpret everything I had gone through throughout the entire game, the thing that would leave me in awe. And instead, I was left in confusion. A bunch of vague images that seem to imply things that don't make a lot of sense, and a final piece of dialogue that makes as much sense.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
And my first impulse was to start trying to find what I must have missed. I started looking into the manuscript pages I didn't find, including the ones you can only get on the hardest difficulty, assuming they had some significant revelations, but they didn't really. I tried to figure out if there were any major reveals in the DLCs or in Remedy's other games that apparently take place in the same universe, but no luck. I watched Games is Lit's wonderful video on the game that you should totally watch, But as wonderful as it was, it provided no new revelations about the plot. I was looking for patterns, searching for hidden answers that it felt like Remedy Entertainment was hiding from me. And eventually, after a little bit of time distanced from it, this all reminded me of something. Conspiracy theories. Yes, those wonderful little things that are chipping away at the very foundation of American democracy are not dissimilar to what I was doing. Conspiracy theories are made up of seeming patterns and the search for answers that the ones in charge, i.e. Remedy, i.e. the government, i.e. our reptilian overlords, want us to never find. But they left clues for us to follow because what fun is a secret if people don't have at least a chance of figuring it out? And while I obviously wasn't viewing Remedy as some kind of overlord trying to take over our minds with 5G towers and vaccines, what I was doing and how I was treating this game and my dissatisfaction with its supposed answers, while not identical to conspiracy theory thinking, was undeniably similar. And all of that thinking led me to an article called The Psychology of Conspiracy Theories, a review of the available research on conspiracy belief at the time of its publication in 2017. And this review posits 3 primary motives for conspiracy belief: existential, epistemic, and social motives, which respectively are the desire for control over our environment, the desire for subjective certainty and security in our understanding, and the desire for a positive image of the self and the in-group. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized how much this not only related to my personal experience of Alan Wake, but to the story of Alan Wake itself. Because within this story, each of those 3 motives is represented. The desire for control is pretty evident, as the entire impetus of the story is the fact that our protagonist, Alan Wake, is dealing with writer's block. He's an incredibly popular thriller author, most well known for a series of books about some guy named Alex Casey. But ever since he pulled a Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and killed off the character that made him famous, he hasn't been able to write a word. And this has left Alan in a very uncomfortable position, even somewhat haunted by this inability, with the very opening of the game being a nightmare where Alan is literally inserted into one of his stories and attacked by characters angry with him for the way he controls their lives and kills them off when it adds to the drama. It immediately sets up this notion of writing as being an act of control. A writer controls the story, where it goes, what the characters do, what questions are being asked, and what the answers to those questions are. But now, with this apparently intense level of writer's block, not only does he not have control over anything, his stories are, metaphorically, turning on him. And while he comes to the town of Bright Falls to get away from everything, even that seems out of his control. There are fans of his in this town who recognize him, a radio host who desperately wants to get an interview with him. His agent won't leave him alone, and even his own wife Alice, albeit with the best of intentions, is trying to get him to write while he's just trying to escape it. It's safe to say that this writer's block leaves Alan without any real control over his life, mostly because his entire identity in many ways has become his job of being a writer. And that's an idea that manifests itself elsewhere in the game as well. Later in the game, Alan starts coming into contact with the Taken, residents of Bright Falls who have been essentially possessed by the game's central antagonist, the Dark Presence. And many of them tend to say some rather strange things for the game's main enemies.
Cabins for rent in
Bright Falls does need hunting licenses.
But while those are very strange things, there's a very clear pattern to what they're saying. They are things they would say as a part of their jobs. A park ranger talks about fishing permits. A nurse at a psychiatric facility talks about rules around watching TV. Cops say that you're under arrest. That Games is Lit video I talked about earlier actually brings this up, referring to the way that the Dark Presence reduces people to the broadest strokes of their identity. But I think more specifically, it's reducing people's identities to their jobs, the things that people have dedicated their lives to. And so, if your job is your identity and Alan's job is as a writer and Alan can't write, then who even is he, and what worth does he really have? Obviously, this makes him all frustrated, fearful, and even somewhat paranoid. When Alice shows him that typewriter, hopeful that he'll be able to find himself again through writing, he goes off on her, not only yelling at her, but taking just about everything she says in the worst faith possible, assuming she has some negative perception of him when she's just trying to help. His life feels out of control, and that leads him to believe that the best thing about his life is slowly turning against him. And that dark presence, the thing that lives inside Cauldron Lake, the thing that wants to escape, offers Alan a sense of control. With Alice being taken by the dark presence, this old woman named Barbara Jagger, a sort of vessel for the dark presence, starts pushing him to write a story called Departure, guilting him to write it really by saying that it's his fault that Alice is in danger at all, and that this story will supposedly save her. And inspired by that fear and that guilt, Alan is not only able to write again, not only able to control a story, but what he writes comes true in the real world. He is literally controlling the lives of everyone in Bright Falls. But of course, he's not actually in control. Barbara Jagger serves as a sort of editor for him, but not the type of editor that works with you and helps to make the story better. No, it's the type of editor who wants to make your story theirs.
But it seems I have an imaginary editor to help me. She's an old woman in a funeral dress. I call her Barbara Jagger. She's very strict. I'm writing faster and faster. My manuscript is being heavily revised. The edits are getting very aggressive, and each day there's less of me and more of her. I hate it, but I know she's right.
The story isn't his, it's hers. He's simply being manipulated through guilt and fear into helping the dark presence escape the lake by being allowed the illusion of control. He's writing for the first time in 2 years, and in Alan's mind, that is the thing that would solve all his problems. His identity would reconstitute itself. He wouldn't be so anxious and paranoid. Barbara Jagger is allowing him that, allowing that answer to be real, even if it isn't. And that's often the promise of conspiracy theories as well. According to the psychology of conspiracy theories, quote, people who lack instrumental control may be afforded some compensatory sense of control by conspiracy theories, because they offer them the opportunity to reject official narratives and feel they possess an alternative account. And that studies have shown that people are likely to turn to conspiracy theories when they are anxious and feel powerless. End quote. Alan feels powerless, he feels out of control, and so he clings to a narrative that seems like it would give him some sense of control of what's going on. But the psychology of conspiracy theories also says that, quote, experimental exposure to conspiracy theories appears to immediately suppress people's sense of autonomy and control, and it makes people less inclined to take actions that in the long run might boost their autonomy and control, end quote. While conspiracy theories from afar seem to allow people to believe they're more in control of a narrative than someone else, have the feeling that they sought out the truth and the answers, put the pieces together on their own, it was really just someone with ulterior motives convincing them that they had control when they didn't. And to Alan's credits, he does manage to realize that, writing his own escape into the story by way of pulling in a man named Thomas Zane, a writer that the Dark Presence had tried to do this with years before. Alan gets away, but he's still groggy and barely conscious, crashing his car through a guardrail, and when he finally comes to, he's lost all memory of what's happened. And from there, the desire for certainty becomes very real. Most of the game is built around that epistemic motive, the quest for answers that takes up the vast majority of the game's second act. But even from the very beginning, this is established as a game about answers.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end.
It's very overbearing foreshadowing that we're not going to get all the answers about everything by the time the game is over. But in spite of that, Alan's most central goal is to find answers. He doesn't learn all that stuff about Barbara Jagger until the end of episode 4. Like I said, he loses his entire memory of that week he spent writing. So he starts this journey in a place of total uncertainty about what's going on or even the fate of Alice. And uncertainty sits right alongside a lack of control. Look at the character of Dr. Hartman in the game, a man who runs a psychiatric facility for artists, but in reality is using his patients to study the way that Cauldron Lake manipulates reality. And the way he does this with Alan is by sending some guy to act like he's kidnapped Alice in order to get Alan's manuscript from him. But when that fails, Hartman takes Alan to his facility and tries to convince him that he's going through a psychotic break brought on by the death of his wife. He's claiming to have certainty, answers about what's been happening to Alan, but in reality, he's just trying to make Alan uncertain of what is real in order to control him. When we feel uncertain about our environments, it's difficult to feel that we have control over it. And thus, when we feel we don't have control over our environment, a way to reinstill that sense of control would be to understand that environment. And a natural way to do that is to search for patterns, even patterns that aren't real. Take this study done by Jennifer Whitson and Adam Galinsky that says, quote, "Experiencing a loss of control led participants to desire more structure and to perceive illusory patterns. The need to be and feel in control is so strong that individuals will produce a pattern from noise to return the world to a predictable state." End quote. Now, obviously, Alan Wake is not seeing illusory patterns in the game, and in fact, the patterns he finds are key to understanding what's going on. But I bring this study in to show just how strong that desire for understanding is, particularly when in a state of little control. It is a natural thing to desire certainty, to understand how your environment and the people in it function. And pattern perception is a very useful tool to do that. In fact, in a different study along the same lines, it said that pattern perception, quote, "is a functional process, as it enables people to recognize basic patterns that are real and that are important to internalize," end quote. Such as how drinking water makes you not thirsty anymore. It is a practical thing that we evolved to do because it has helped us. We need to understand things, and pattern perception is a tried and true method to accomplish that. Our ability to perceive patterns, especially more complex ones, is a major part of the appeal of mystery stories to begin with. The aspect of audience participation, the chance for the audience to flex those pattern perception muscles. As the protagonist is finding the clues and uncovering new information, the audience is attempting to puzzle it all together, figure it out before the answer is given to us. And that means a mystery story must strike a balance between frustration and intrigue. You want to give people a sense that they could solve this mystery on their own without making it too easy to do just that, and leaving the audience bored as they just sit there waiting for a twist they already know is coming. But you also don't want to hold so much back for so long that the audience becomes frustrated and confused. You want to maintain a certain level of intrigue that keeps the audience guessing, while not leaving them completely in the dark. But the strange thing about mystery stories is that we want to be fooled. We want to be tricked. We don't want to figure it out before it's given to us, because what fun is a twist that you see coming? We want the grand reveal, the big show, and even if we did figure it out already, we don't want to be certain about it. But the caveat there is that we only want to be uncertain because there is a tacit promise that comes with any mystery story that we will eventually be made certain. We will eventually be told what happened, whether we figured it out or not. A mystery story plays on that desperation for certainty, allows us the satisfaction, maybe even the thrill of regaining it by temporarily stealing it away. And Alan Wake, for most of the game, does this all very well, in my opinion. It regularly shares new information that helps us further build our understanding of what's going on, while also continuously introducing new layers to the mystery, forcing you to rethink what you thought you knew. And when those bigger revelations come through, it is extremely satisfying. But, I repeat, it only maintains that balance for most of the game. Because as I alluded to earlier, at the end of episode 4, with 2 whole episodes still left to go, you get pretty much all the answers you could ever hope to have. All the answers that are truly important to the main story anyway. Answers about what happened during the week Alan was missing, who Barbara Jagger is and what she's trying to accomplish, who's been leaving all those yellow messages around, who Thomas Zane is and what he did. It tells you basically everything with around 3 to 4 hours of game still left to go. And because of that, I was left believing there had to be something more. There had to be some other answer that I had yet to be given, but if there was, I didn't even know the question. Ironically, despite having all these answers, I felt even more uncertain than I did before. And the further I went into the game, the more that I just felt like it was getting in my way of those answers. And I felt that balance slowly but surely dip into just sheer frustration. A great representation of all this in the game itself is how the nature of Alan and Alice's relationship changes over the course of the story. At the beginning of the game, they seem like a perfectly happy couple in spite of Alan's troubles. Alice herself seems almost like a perfect character who is there to do nothing but support Alan and be his muse. But the further we get into the game, the more complex their relationship grows. The further you get, the more you realize that Alan's problems go beyond the occasional outburst.
He's more and more out of control all the time. The parties, he's so angry all the time. He's getting violent.
Do you mean with you?
No, not with me. No, never. Sometimes I almost wish Alan would take a swing at me, because at least that'd lead to a conversation he couldn't just march out of. But no. He's too deep in his own problems, always going on about something else. I'm so afraid I'm gonna lose him, and we're not even talking anymore.
We get all this information about them, but the more information we get, the more sides we see it from, the more uncertain we become about the nature of their relationship. How does that coexist with the more positive elements we saw before, the more positive elements we see after? How does all of that work? And then we get to that ending, made up of a bunch of vague images that seem to imply things that don't make a lot of sense, and a final piece of dialogue that makes as much sense. It's not a lake, it's an ocean. I am lacking that grand reveal. I have all the answers, and yet certainty eludes my grasp. There is a sense that there is more than I am being told, more answers I do not know to questions I haven't even thought to ask. And how can I feel satisfied with the answers I have when they clearly do not even crack the surface of what is really going on? And with conspiracy theories, it's a similar situation. The psychology of conspiracy theories states that, quote, recent experiments indicate that presenting people with persuasive arguments for conspiracy theories about vaccination and climate change increases their levels of uncertainty, end quote. From afar, conspiracy theories seem to promise you the answers you are not being given. They seem to promise a certainty that you may not possess, and yet they only create more uncertainty and more questions. I'd conjecture that it has something to do with the way that conspiracy theories often create some alternative world that we don't live in, and much like Alan Wake, they seem to allude to ideas that are far beyond our current knowledge, answers hidden far beyond where we can reach them, and in the effort to defend those beliefs, you have to keep finding ways to justify them. Keep searching for answers to cover every possible base, and every answer just comes with another question that you have to come up with another answer for, and eventually, what are you left with? You're in so deep now that you can't possibly go back. You may be drowning in uncertainty, you may not feel in control, but you just have to keep swimming. Because if you admit that you're drowning, if you admit that you should never have jumped into this ocean, then what does that say about you? If I could, I'd like to go back to In Cold Blood for a moment, because it is a book about truth, or rather the way we interact with the concept of truth. When Dewey is told the truth, exactly what happened in that house that night, he is dissatisfied. It's not good enough for him. He accepts it ultimately, but all he really finds in it is the anger he already had towards it. The whole reason he was as dedicated to this as he was. All he really finds in the truth is what he already felt and believed. In Cold Blood, ultimately, is a story about how truth cannot be reliably communicated, nor can it be reliably witnessed. Because in order for it to be, it must go through layers upon layers of internal bias, personal belief, prejudice, and individual perspective. And as it goes through those layers, whether it is going in or coming out, the truth must be, to a certain extent, bent and twisted in order to find a way through. And if it can't get through, if it cannot be bent and twisted enough, then it is much easier to just throw it out completely than to try and change the layers it has to pass through. We'd rather just find something that already fits. Even the novel and Truman Capote himself are not immune to this. Despite Capote's insistence that everything in the book is entirely factual, it is clearly biased in many ways, not the least of which being the incredibly sympathetic portrait of Perry Smith as a tragic figure, as much a victim of the world as a perpetrator of these crimes, and thus only the most basic facts of the case can be fully known. And those facts are that on November 15th, 1959, in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas, a family of 4 was brutally murdered in their home, and they didn't have to be. The final motive for conspiracy theories we have yet to discuss is the social motive, the desire for a positive sense of self and the in-group. And in Alan Wake, that motive is the most prevalent one, because I think it's the most foundational one. It's the source of everything. This was all built on writer's block, Alan not really knowing who he is anymore, yelling at his wife because he thinks that she hates him for it. And he has this guilt stashed inside of him for how he treats her, embodied in the way that Barbara Jagger so easily manipulates him through that. He's lost in a world that doesn't make sense, desperately trying to figure out what's going on and having people question his sanity at every turn. All of this started with a nightmare where even the stories he wrote hated him. That one study I cited earlier from Jennifer Whitson and Adam Galinsky talked about how the loss of control increased the frequency of illusory pattern perception. But it also posited a possible solution to the problem. It says that, quote, the causal link between a lack of control and illusory pattern perception is reduced by affirming the self. When individuals were made to feel psychologically secure after lacking control, they were less prone to the perception of illusory patterns. End quote. And so, lacking control alongside an insecure sense of self leads to illusory pattern perception, the desperation for certainty. These are not 3 separate motives. These are interlocked, a vicious cycle that can start anywhere. The lack of control leads to a search for certainty, and when that certainty eludes you, it leads to a negative self-perception, which leads to a desperation to reinstill that control, that leads to a desperation for certainty, which leads to a desperation for self-love, and on and on and on the cycle goes. Pattern perception is an incredibly useful thing, a necessary thing, but when you are desperate to find that positive sense of self, it becomes so much easier to find patterns that aren't there, or rather to not question the patterns that you find, even if they are obviously wrong. And that doesn't just apply to conspiracy theories. There are so many ways that normal cognitive processes just don't work the way they're supposed to. So many kinds of psychological accidents. Face pareidolia is the phenomenon where we see faces in things that don't have faces. And the reason we do that is because our brain is programmed to find faces, because it's useful to find faces and glean social information from them. But our brains are not particularly fine-tuned, so sometimes we see faces in trees or buildings or the surface of Mars, because they meet the most basic requirements for a face. These are not things that are specific to certain people or certain types of people. This is stuff that happens to everybody. Normal cognitive processes that just go haywire a little bit. Psychological accidents. And sometimes we let them, because it might be useful to us. It may be maladaptive, force us to see patterns that aren't there, read into what people say to look for justifications for why you think they hate you, look at yourself and tell yourself stories about how you're not good enough. because of all of these things that you've done wrong, conveniently leaving out all the good, because it is easier to just find what already fits through the layers of bias in our mind than to change the layers themselves. How does Alan Wake defeat the dark presence? By using a broken clicker, a light switch from Alan's childhood that Alan Wake wrote that Thomas Zane wrote would have the power to defeat it. Yeah, the story gets rather convoluted near the end, but we're going to ignore it. The clicker does not have any real power. It is literally broken. But when Alan was a kid, his mother gave him that clicker, told him that if he pressed the button, any monsters in the dark would be driven away. Alan believed that the clicker had power, and so it did. And now here, Alan is essentially doing the same thing as an adult, believing that it has power. Alan is able to stop the dark presence because he believes that he is able to stop the dark presence. There are many characters in this game who claim to be on Alan's side and tell him stories about what's really happening to justify their status as allies. Barbara Jagger tells him that she can help him save Alice. Dr. Hartman tells him that he's going through a psychotic break that he can help treat. The dark presence even tries to convince Alan through a fake Alice that this is all a dream. And he could have accepted any of those stories or theories as the truth. He could have just kept writing the manuscript for Barbara Jagger. He could have just stayed with Dr. Hartman. He could have just gone back to bed with the fake Alice. But he doesn't, because they can't give him what he's looking for. In order to find the truth, Alan has to find his own sense of self-worth. He has to give himself the ability to illuminate the darkness. He has to think for himself. But at the same time, he has to recognize the limitations and fallibility of his perception. The last line of the game that I think makes a little bit more sense to me now is,
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
a lake is a relatively small thing, a limited thing. It's a specific environment with generally consistent surroundings, and they're usually not that deep. It's pretty easy to get a full idea of a specific lake, but an ocean? An ocean is a vast, infinitely complex ecosystem. It is most of the world, and there are vast swaths of it that remain unexplored, and mysteries within it that we may never fully know. And at the end of this game, the final words are, it's not a lake, it's an ocean. Alan gives himself the ability to find truth, but ultimately accepts that truth by its very nature is uncertain. And in that, maybe the point of Alan Wake is not the answers. I'm not going to say that there are no answers to Alan Wake. I haven't played the DLCs or Control, and maybe Alan Wake 2 itself will be where the grand reveal I was waiting for occurs. I'm not saying there aren't answers in the same way I'm not saying there is no such thing as truth. But I do think that the point of Alan Wake is not to search for the answers, but to accept the lack of them. To accept that every perspective is valid, as in it is real and based on some level of experience and knowledge and feeling, but no perspective is complete. Because we cannot know everything. We cannot see things from everybody's point of view, and our perception is deeply fallible. We need to be critical of it. We need to question it, and we need to keep an open mind for new information. And as hard as it might be, we have to be willing to consider changing the layers in our minds to allow the truth to fit. And art, both creating it and engaging with it, is a means of seeking truth, but also a process of accepting uncertainty. It's a means of searching through the world and our lives and feelings and beliefs to find truth, but it is also being willing to sit with the uncertainty when it arrives, to not run away from it, but to greet it like an old friend. Creating art is not an act of control where you decide the answers. It can only be where you ask the questions and explore the possibilities.
A story is not a machine that does what you tell it. A story is a beast with a life of its own. You can create it, shape it, but as the story grows, it starts wanting things of its own.
Artists like Alan Wake have a responsibility to be honest, to tell the truth even when the truth is that you don't know. Because sometimes it's okay to not know. Artists have a responsibility to illuminate the truth, not to peddle falsehoods shrouded in dark cloaks. Art must be courageous, not cowardly. It must be courageous enough to engage with the truth even if it is scary, even if it makes you question things, even if it makes you feel bad about yourself because you didn't know or because you didn't care to know. And it must not be cowardly, relying on what you already believe and refusing to allow any new information in. So, here's the truth. I do not know all the answers. I never will. And I'm not gonna lie, I am still unsatisfied with the ending of Alan Wake. But I don't think the point was to be satisfied. I think the point was that it's not a lake, it's an ocean.